single silver coin found in a Swedish field tells a secret story. It was minted in Baghdad over 1,000 years ago, yet it ended up in the frozen north. This coin is a tiny fragment of a vast, forgotten network, the perilous Arctic trade routes that secretly connected medieval Scandinavia to the Islamic Caliphate. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a global economy flourished in the shadows of the ice, changing our map of the medieval world forever. We will uncover how traders navigated impossible seas and why they risked everything for a commodity more precious than gold. What drove them into the Earth's most unforgiving environment, and what did they bring back that reshaped their world? What does it mean when history forgets a connection this profound that silver dirham is far from alone? Thousands of its kind have been found across Scandinavia, from bustling Viking trading towns to isolated farmsteads above the Arctic Circle. Each one is a data point, and when plotted on a map, they form a startling pattern. The concentration of these coins is densest in eastern Sweden and around the Baltic, yes, but they also appear in a trail that leads northward, up the Scandinavian peninsula toward the top of the world. This geographic clue is the first crack in the conventional story. If the primary route was the famous river networks of Eastern Europe, why are so many coins surfacing in the far north, in places like the island of, or the mainland region of? These were not major population centers. They were frontier settlements, places where the midnight sun rules the summer and the polar night descends in winter. The presence of Arabic silver there is an anomaly, an outlier that whispers of a different path. It suggests that while some traders traveled south and east through the lands of the, others looked north and west, into the icy embrace of the Arctic Ocean. This is where the map of known medieval trade routes ends and the realm of speculation and daring begins. The coins are the evidence that something happened, but to understand the how, we must ask a more fundamental question. What could possibly motivate anyone to attempt such a journey? The answer lies not in the silver itself, but in what the silver was meant to buy. The Arctic Ocean was a world of liquid chaos and shifting walls of ice. For a medieval sailor, it represented the very edge of the known world, a place where maps faded into blank parchment and legends took over. To even conceive of sailing, a trade route across this frozen desert required a leap of imagination that defies our modern understanding of geography. How do you navigate a sea where the sun never sets for months, where the magnetic compass becomes unreliable, and where the coastline itself is a temporary sculpture of ice? The answer was not found in a single tool, but in a sophisticated tapestry of ancient technology and hard-won environmental wisdom. Norse sagas speak vaguely of lands bathed in perpetual daylight, but the practical knowledge belonged to the hunters and traders who ventured furthest. They used crystals known as sunstones, which could polarize light, revealing the sun's position even through thick cloud cover or the haze of the midnight sun. They watched the flight patterns of seabirds, knowing certain species would always fly toward the nearest land. Most importantly, they possessed an oral library of sailing directions, passed from father to son, chanted in rhythmic verses that memorized landmarks, currents, and safe harbors. This was not random exploration. Experts like archaeologists point to the incremental push northward, driven by an intense demand for Arctic luxuries. The initial goal was not Baghdad, but the walrus and narwhal hunting grounds. These animals provided ivory, a commodity as white and valuable as elephant tusk, and their tough hide made perfect ship ropes. Each hunting expedition extended their mental map a little further, stitching together a secret chart of the polar sea. The deepest mystery lies in what they learned about the ocean itself. They came to understand the complex dance of currents, like the Gulf Stream's warmer tendrils that could create ice-free corridors, and the predictable patterns of seasonal, pack ice formation and breakup. This knowledge was so valuable, so critical to survival and profit, that it became a form of intellectual property, guarded fiercely within certain trader families. It was a living science, now mostly lost to time, though scholars find tantalizing hints in cryptic runic inscriptions that mention tide times and sailing days. This navigational enigma solves the first part of our puzzle. They had the capability, but capability alone does not create a trade route spanning continents. What transformed these dangerous hunting voyages into a structured commercial pipeline? The motivation must have been overwhelming, a pull so strong it justified the unimaginable risk. The pull was a simple, brilliant economic equation. Norse ships carried iron tools, fine woolen cloth, and Baltic amber northward. In return, they sought the Arctic's most coveted treasure, furs. Not just any furs, but the winter pelts of animals like the Arctic fox, the sable, and the beaver, creatures whose coats grew impossibly thick and luxuriant in the extreme cold. In the markets of Baghdad and Constantinople, these furs were not mere clothing. They were a supreme status symbol, a wearable declaration of wealth and power that fetched astronomical prices. This created a relentless economic engine. A single high-quality pelt, obtained for a few iron knives in the north, could be traded and re-traded across continents, eventually converting into a small fortune in Islamic silver. This was the silent fuel for the entire perilous enterprise. But to collect this cargo, the Norse needed a gateway, a place to meet the hunters who lived on the ice's edge. That place was not a city on any map, but a secret whispered among traders. They called it. If you sailed north along the Norwegian coast until the land began to curve eastward, you would eventually enter the sheltered, ice-choked waters of the White Sea. Its southern shores, where the great northern river meets the sea, was the heart of. Modern archaeology has uncovered something fascinating here. Instead of the stone foundations of a permanent town, researchers find evidence of seasonal camps. There are hearths lined with stones, temporary post holes for shelters, and layers of cultural debris that appear only in summer sediment. This was a silent port, appearing for a few frantic weeks each year, and then vanishing with the first frost. For the Norse, arriving after a harrowing open ocean voyage, this sheltered bay was a sanctuary. For the indigenous, likely Ugric peoples ancestral to today's Sami and Komi, it was a carefully orchestrated opportunity. Imagine the scene during the brief Arctic summer. Norse, their broad hulls laden with trade goods, glide into the river mouth. They are met not by a town, but by a gathering. Hunters arrive from the vast taiga forests and tundra, their sledges piled with bundles of pristine furs. What followed was a complex, silent ballet of commerce conducted across language barriers. They likely used a pidgin tongue, a mix of Old Norse and local dialects, or communicated through gesture and the universal language of displayed goods. The Norse laid out their durable iron axes, their bolts of colorful woven cloth, and perhaps beads of amber that caught the low northern sun. The presented stacks of pelts, each one a masterpiece of nature's insulation. The air would be thick with the smell of salt, pine, and tanned hides, filled with the sounds of bartering and the creak of ships being loaded with a new, far more valuable cargo. This cultural twilight zone left behind a unique archaeological signature. At sites around the White Sea, archaeologists find very few personal items. What they do find are the professional tools of the trade. Exquisitely calibrated Norse folding balances and small, standardized brass weights used to measure silver dust and hack silver. Alongside them are found ornate silver pendants and belt fittings of a distinct style, items that may have been made from melted down Islamic coins. These objects tell a clear story. This was not a place for settling down or leaving heirlooms. It was a functional, transient marketplace where value was measured, exchanged, and immediately moved along the chain. The Norse did not come to conquer or colonize, they came strictly to trade, for the hunters held the true power here. They controlled the source of the luxury that fueled an empire's desire. After loading their ships with furs, the Norse traders would turn back south, their hulls now sitting lower in the water, carrying the white gold of the Arctic. But for the most ambitious, the journey was only half complete. The furs were valuable, but to convert them into the ultimate prize, that gleaming Baghdad silver, they needed to go further. The route now turned away from the icy north, pointing toward the sun-baked markets of the east, demanding a passage through a landscape not of water, but of endless, whispering forest. The return journey from was a reversal of fortune, a ship now heavy with Arctic treasure. But this cargo's destination lay over 1,000 miles to the southeast, in the storied cities of the Caliphate. To reach them, the traders faced a geographical puzzle that no ship could sail directly. The Arctic Ocean offered no passage east. The route instead turned brutally inland, following the veins of the continent itself. This was the Overland Gauntlet, a journey defined not by open water, but by a labyrinth of rivers and a crushing physical ordeal known as the Portage. The system began where the White Sea trade ended, at the mouth of the mighty Northern River. Sailing south against the current, the traders would eventually reach a critical point where the headwaters nearly brushed against those of another river system flowing in the opposite direction, east toward the Volga. This was the watershed, the continental divide. Here, the real work began. The ship, a sturdy, designed for ocean waves, now became a dead weight on land. To move from one river network to the next, everything had to come out. The bales of furs, the tusks of ivory, every barrel of supplies and personal belonging was unloaded. Then, using ropes, levers, and sheer muscle, the crew would roll their vessel onto a bed of greased logs. They transformed their ship into a sled, dragging it for miles across forest trails, through boggy lowlands swarming with insects in summer, or across frozen, unforgiving ground in other seasons. This back-breaking transfer was a portage, and the journey from the Arctic to the sea required several of them, a series of grueling relays connecting to the Volga and its tributary, the Kama River. This riverine highway, known broadly as the Volga trade route, was the economic spine of Eastern Europe. For the Norse, it was a transformative corridor. Once their ship was back in the water on the Volga side, the current finally worked with them, carrying them south and east into a completely different world. The dense pine forests of the north gradually gave way to open steppes. The river itself became a bustling aquatic highway, crowded with vessels from diverse cultures, Bulgar merchants from the middle Volga, Khazar traders from the lower reaches, and Slavs and Finns from the woodlands. The Arctic furs and ivory, so rare this far south, immediately marked the Norse as men of substantial wealth. We are granted an extraordinary glimpse of this moment because a curious Arab diplomat was there to write it down. In the year 922, a scholar and envoy named was sent from Baghdad to the court of the Volga Bulgars. His mission was religious and political, but his keen eye was captured by the strange northern traders he encountered on the riverbanks. He called them and his account is the most vivid eyewitness portrait we have. He describes them as tall as date palms, ruddy complexioned, and tattooed from fingernails to neck. He watched, with a mixture of fascination and distaste, their morning ritual of washing and combing their hair from a single bowl, and he meticulously catalogued their goods. He saw the swords and axes they carried, but more importantly, he noted the luxuries they sold: sable and black fox pelts, the very furs from the Arctic frontier. For historians, swords are a precious suture, stitching the archaeological evidence of northern coins and southern goods directly to the living, breathing people who moved them. He confirms the endpoint of the Overland Gauntlet. After months of river travel, the Norse would finally reach the great trading hub of the Khazar capital at the Volga's mouth, or the bustling markets of Bulgar. Here, in a multilingual frenzy of commerce, the Arctic furs were exchanged for the ultimate prize: heavy, gleaming silver dirhams from the mints of Baghdad and Samarkand. The circle was nearly complete, but for the silver to find its way into a Swedish field, one final, mysterious return journey remained. Yet for all its promise, the Volga was not a free highway. Every bend in the river held a potential toll, and the most powerful gatekeepers of all awaited the Norse traders in the middle reaches. Here, controlling the vital confluence where the Kama River met the Volga, was the realm of the Volga Bulgars. This was the third great mystery of the journey, the nature of the deal struck between the rough-hewn northerners and this sophisticated Islamic Turkic kingdom. Were the Bulgars peaceful partners or ruthless monopolists squeezing profit from a captive trade? The historical whispers we have are frustratingly contradictory, painting a relationship that constantly shifted between symbiotic trade and tense rivalry. On one hand, the Bulgars had converted to Islam and built a society that mirrored the great caliphates to the south, with scholars, poets, and a complex bureaucracy. They craved stability and the steady flow of goods. The Norse brought them the unparalleled luxury of Arctic furs, which the Bulgars could then sell at a massive markup to caravans heading for Baghdad and, in return, the Norse received not just silver, but also exotic southern goods like silks, spices, and finely crafted glassware. It was a classic middleman economy, and for long periods it worked. The Bulgar capital, Great Bulgar, became a glittering emporium. Imagine a city of wooden palaces and bustling markets rising from the riverbank, its minarets a strange, beautiful sight to Norse eyes accustomed to wooden longhouses and stave churches. Here, in specialized warehouses, bales of furs were carefully unpacked, assessed by expert appraisers, graded for quality and taxed. The Bulgars did not just take a cut, they added value. They prepared the cargo for its final, overland push across the steppes, ensuring it was packaged and documented to meet the exacting standards of the Caliphate's merchants. Their wealth was entirely built on this single, brilliant fact. They were the indispensable gatekeepers, the only ones who could smoothly translate the wealth of the frozen north into the currency of the desert south. But this partnership had a razor's edge. Other sources, including tense diplomatic and archaeological finds of fortified trading posts, suggest a darker side. The Bulgars held a geographic stranglehold. If they chose to, they could block the river, hike tolls to exorbitant levels, or even confiscate cargo under thin pretenses. For the Norse, arriving after months of perilous travel, the threat of being cheated at this final commercial hurdle must have been a constant, gnawing anxiety. There is evidence they sometimes tried to bypass the Bulgars entirely, using smaller tributaries or attempting risky overland shortcuts, which only led to clashes. The relationship was thus a perpetual dance of power and need. The Bulgars needed the Norse goods, but they also needed to control the Norse. The Norse needed Bulgar markets and logistics, but they chafed under their control. This tense equilibrium made Great Bulgar not just a hub of commerce, but a crucible of cultural exchange under pressure. It was here that Norse traders, living in their own segregated riverbank enclaves, would have encountered Islamic law, Arabic script, and the call to prayer 5 times a day. They would have learned which officials to bribe and which to avoid, how to negotiate in the local tongue, and the precise weight and purity standards their silver was expected to meet. Every dirham that eventually found its way back to Scandinavia carried with it the invisible stamp of this complex, fraught relationship. The Bulgars were the final filter, the last obstacle before the silver could begin its long journey home. And that return trip, the closing of the circle, held dangers and mysteries of its own, forcing us to ask a haunting question about the true cost of this glittering Arctic trade. The river journey ended not at a city, but at a horizon of impossible blue. After months navigating the brown, silt-laden waters of the Volga, the Norse traders would have reached its delta, where the great river shattered into 100 channels before spilling into the sea. This was a profound geographical and psychological threshold. They had spent their entire lives on rivers and the familiar, if treacherous, of the Atlantic. There was something else entirely, a vast, landlocked saline sea, subject to its own violent storms and governed by powers they did not know. Their sturdy, perfect for the open ocean and river portages, were suddenly out of place here. The required different ships, shallow-drafted dhows with lateen sails, designed by Arab and Khazar shipwrights who understood its unique, often furious, weather patterns. For most Norse traders, this is where their personal journey likely stopped. The logistical leap was too great. Instead, in the bustling ports at the Volga's mouth, like the Khazar capital of, they would have offloaded their precious bales of furs and tusks. These goods were then transferred to the holds of merchant vessels, operated by local sailors who served as the final link in this global chain. This handoff was a moment of immense trust and precise calculation. After surviving the Arctic and the river Gauntlet, the Norse now had to rely on a separate network of strangers to deliver their cargo to its ultimate buyers. They were paid in silver on the spot, or perhaps given complex letters of credit, trusting that their partners across the water would honor the agreements. The itself was a world of legend and danger. Arab geographers wrote of its sudden, devastating storms that could swallow ships whole, and of pirates lurking in its coastal inlets. While famous accounts like mention the launching raids on its southern shores, these were likely exceptional events, dramatic outliers in a system built on careful commerce. Sustained raiding would have poisoned the very trade relationships that made the silver flow. For the professional merchants who moved the furs, the goal was safe, predictable passage. This final sea leg was dominated by Khazar, and increasingly, Muslim sailors whose families had plied these waters for generations. They carried the northern luxuries southward, either to fortified ports like the gateway to the Caucasus, or further to landing points where caravans would begin the overland trek toward Baghdad and the markets of the Caliphate. The Norse silver was now secure, but its journey home would retrace a path fraught with its own perils, a return through a landscape where wealth made you a target. From this western shore, the world changed from water to stone. The great caravan routes now began, threading their way into the jagged spine of the Caucasus Mountains. This is the most shadowy phase of the entire journey, a blank space on the historical map where the trail of the Norse and their furs grows faint. We have coins in Sweden and accounts from the Volga, but here, in the high passes between the Black Sea and the specific footprints of those northern traders vanish into the whispers of geography. The mystery is not if the goods traveled this way, but precisely how. The Caucasus was not a single road, but a tangled knot of ancient paths, each controlled by different kingdoms, clans, and customs officials. Which path did the precious Arctic cargo take? The famous gorge, a narrow defile guarded by formidable fortresses, offered a direct but heavily monitored route. Further south, passes controlled by the Kingdom of Georgia or Armenian principalities might have provided alternatives, each with its own political price. This was a landscape where geography dictated destiny, and every mountain valley held a potential toll collector or a band of raiders. The political volatility was constant. Petty kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted with the seasons, and a route deemed safe one year could become a death trap the next. This inherent risk added a tremendous premium to any bale of furs or bundle of walrus tusks that successfully completed the trek. Their value was no longer just in their material, but in the sheer improbability of their arrival. Who guided these final terrestrial steps? It is highly unlikely that Norse traders, experts in ships and snow, personally led caravans over these peaks. Instead, the transfer almost certainly happened through a chain of specialized middlemen. In the ports, local Khazar or Muslim merchants would have sold the northern goods to another group of professionals, Armenian or Georgian caravan masters. These men were the undisputed experts of the mountain passage. For centuries, their networks had connected the steppes to the Mediterranean and the Caliphate. They knew which mountain lord currently demanded the fairest bribe, which pass had the least spring avalanche risk, and where the safest caravanserais, fortified inns, were located for the night. They possessed the right animals, sure-footed mules and camels acclimated to the thin air, and they employed guards familiar with the terrain. The Arctic luxuries, then, would have been seamlessly integrated into larger mixed caravans. A single caravan might carry Chinese silks, Indian spices, carpets, and tucked among them, the rare, dense furs from the top of the world. This integration was a logistical masterpiece. The furs and ivory, having already survived the Arctic and the rivers, were now packed alongside other high-value goods, their provenance becoming just another line in a multilingual manifest. The caravanserais themselves were hubs of this fusion. Imagine a stone fortress in a high valley, its gates closing at dusk. Inside, a courtyard buzzes with a dozen languages. A Georgian merchant haggles with a Persian silk seller by a central well, while Armenian guards share a meal with Arab travelers. And in a corner, wrapped in protective oilcloth, lie the bales that began their journey where the sun does not set. No one in that bustling yard might know the full, epic story of those pelts, but they all understood their extraordinary worth. The safety of the caravan depended on this very anonymity, drawing attention to any one item's origins could invite disaster. The final leg through the Caucasus was thus a process of erasure, where a spectacular journey was deliberately folded into the mundane, brutal routine of overland trade. This successful passage delivered the Arctic treasures to their ultimate destination, the glittering markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. But what happened when these symbols of the frozen frontier finally reached the heart of a desert empire? How were they seen, used, and ultimately, what did their presence there signify about the medieval world we thought we knew? The Tigris River was the final artery, a slow, brown current carrying the world's riches toward a single, shimmering point. After the mountain passes and the caravan dust, the Arctic treasures were loaded onto flat-bottomed barges, joining a flotilla of commerce floating downstream to the navel of the universe, Baghdad, the Round City. Founded in the year 762 with the explicit purpose of being the center of the world, its scale was a form of shock. To a Norse trader, whose largest settlements housed a few thousand, the approach to Baghdad was an assault on the senses. The riverbanks thickened into a continuous hive of docks and warehouses, a cacophony of languages shouting over the creak of cranes, unloading spices, porcelain, and timber. The call to prayer from 100 minarets would have woven through the noise like a haunting, unfamiliar melody. This was not a market. It was the market, the grand terminal where all global journeys converged. Within the labyrinthine, the specialized lanes dedicated to specific goods, the northern luxuries finally found their purpose. Here, the walrus tusks, referred to in Arabic inventories as fish teeth, were not merely curiosities. They were raw material for a thriving artistic industry. Master carvers prized this dense, creamy ivory for its workability, transforming it into exquisitely detailed luxury items. Ornate knife handles, delicate cosmetic boxes, and most famously, intricate chess pieces for the caliph's court. The game of chess, a strategic passion of the Islamic elite, demanded pieces of beauty and status. Arctic ivory, having traveled from the edge of the earth, became the physical form of kings, viziers, and knights in a game of imperial power. The furs underwent a similar transformation. In the cold stone palaces of Scandinavia, a sable pelt was a practical, vital layer against the chill. In the sun-baked courtyards of Baghdad, it became pure theater. Adorning the robes of caliphs, viziers, and wealthy merchants, these furs were a silent, potent display of reach. To wear Arctic sable was to announce that your influence and your network stretched beyond the maps, into the mythical lands of perpetual ice. It was proof of connection to a supply chain so long and perilous, it seemed almost magical. This cultural collision was complete. The wealth generated from these final sales did not just line a trader's purse. It flowed into the very heart of the Islamic Golden Age. The silver paid for these luxuries helped fund libraries, observatories, and the work of scholars translating ancient Greek texts. In a profound and invisible circuit, the harsh struggle of the Arctic hunt and the river Portage indirectly supported poetry, mathematics, and astronomy half a world away. The journey, however, was a circle. For the Norse trader standing dazed in the goal was not to stay but to convert this cultural triumph back into portable wealth. He would trade his remaining goods for the heaviest, most reliable currency he could carry, those gleaming silver dirhams, now stuffed into leather sacks. His mind already turning north, he would begin the arduous retrace of his steps, a journey back through the mountains, up the Volga, and over the portages, guarding his fortune against bandits, corrupt officials, and the sea itself. Each coin was a story, a receipt for an epic, and its return to the north would close the loop, seeding the Scandinavian world with silver and a legend of a connected world far wider than anyone at home could possibly believe. But who were the people making this impossible journey? The word that instantly comes to mind is Viking, conjuring images of dragon-proud longships and fearsome raiders. Yet this label is a profound misdirection, a historical simplification that obscures the true identity of these Arctic merchants. The individuals who braved the White Sea and dragged their ships over portages were not primarily warriors seeking plunder. They were something more complex and in many ways more interesting. They were professional traders, and they belonged to a distinct social and economic class known as the. This term, immortalized by, is our key to unlocking the fifth great mystery of this trade network. They were not a single homogeneous people from one Scandinavian homeland. They were a hybrid society, a trade diaspora that emerged from the mingling of Scandinavian adventurers, largely from what is now Sweden, with the Slavic, Finnic, and Baltic peoples of Eastern Europe's riverways. Their power bases were not in Norway or Denmark, but in fortified trading towns far to the east, places like, and the great emporium of Novgorod. These were cosmopolitan hubs where Norse, Slav, and Finn lived side by side, united by the common language of commerce. In these towns, the primary measure of a man was not his prowess in battle, but his skill in negotiation, his knowledge of exchange rates, and his reliability in moving goods across vast distances. The ship they sailed, tells this story perfectly. It was a broad-beamed, deep-hulled cargo vessel, built for capacity and seaworthiness, not for speed or beach assaults. Its design speaks of bulk goods, not a raiding party. This fundamental difference in purpose reshapes our entire understanding of their identity. They were entrepreneurs operating on a global scale, and their greatest weapon was not an axe, but a finely calibrated folding balance for weighing silver. The mystery of their identity deepens further when we look at the genetic and archaeological record along the route. Recent studies of burial sites in places like Russia reveal a fascinating pattern. The graves contain artifacts of unmistakably Scandinavian origin, certain types of brooches, weapons, and Thor's hammer pendants. But the burial rites themselves, the way the individuals were laid to rest, often show strong local influences. This suggests something remarkable. Many of these traders did not just pass through, they settled. They married into local communities, learned new languages, and adopted new customs, all while maintaining a connection to their Norse heritage. They became cultural translators, permanent nodes in the network. Their identity was fluid, adapting seamlessly to the environment they needed to operate within. In the Arctic, they were partners with the hunters. On the Volga, they were the exotic northerners observed by. In their home ports of Novgorod or Kiev, they were the wealthy elite, the boyars whose power was built on furs and silver. This fluidity was their greatest asset. It allowed them to navigate not just geographic boundaries, but social and political ones as well. They could present themselves as trusted partners to multiple groups, a skill far more valuable for long-term trade than the transient terror of a raid. To call them simply Vikings is to erase this nuanced, strategic reality. It reduces a sophisticated, multi-generational commercial enterprise to a series of violent episodes. The truth is, the perilous Arctic trade route was not built by raiders looking for a quick score. It was built and maintained by a trade diaspora, a network of families and partnerships whose legacy was not written in sagas of conquest, but quietly stamped onto thousands of silver coins, scattered like breadcrumbs across the north. This realization forces a final, unsettling question about the entire system. If it was so successful, connecting continents and funding empires, why did it vanish from history? What fragile thread, when pulled, caused this entire web of connection to unravel into silent silver was the glittering prize, but it was not the original goal. To comprehend why anyone would endure such a journey, we must look past the coins to the cargo that bought them. The true Arctic gold, the prime commodity that powered this entire machine, was not mined from the earth but pulled from the freezing sea. It was walrus ivory. In the sophisticated courts of the Abbasid Caliphate, Elephant ivory was a rare and astronomically expensive luxury, imported from distant Africa. Arctic ivory, harvested from the massive tusks of walruses and sometimes from the spiraled teeth of narwhals, became a brilliant, sought-after substitute. Its dense, creamy texture was perfect for carving, and its very origin, from the mythic, frozen edges of the world, added an irresistible layer of prestige. A single, large, unblemished tusk represented a fortune waiting to be unlocked. This demand created a relentless economic engine, one powerful enough to justify unimaginable risks. The hunt for this ivory was itself a monumental feat. Imagine the scene in the frigid Arctic waters off the coast of Greenland or the islands of the White Sea. Small, open boats manned by Norse hunters would approach a walrus haulout, a rocky shore where the enormous, tusked mammals rested in their hundreds. The hunt was perilous and visceral, a clash against creatures that could weigh over a ton and capsize a boat with a thrash of their powerful bodies. Success required immense bravery, skill, and no small amount of fortune. Each tusk represented not just wealth, but survival earned from the very brink of the possible. Once secured, this organic treasure began its transformation. In the workshops of Baghdad and other urban centers, master artisans saw not a raw tusk, but a canvas. They carved this Arctic ivory into objects of breathtaking beauty and function. It was shaped into ornate knife and sword handles for elite warriors, into delicate cosmetic boxes for wealthy households, and into intricate gaming pieces for the chessboards of caliphs and scholars. Most famously, some of the finest medieval chess sets, like the legendary pieces found on the Isle of Lewis, though from a later period, speak to this tradition of transforming ivory into symbols of strategy and power. The journey of a single tusk, from a remote Arctic shore to an elegant artifact in a sun-drenched palace, wove together two worlds that should have never known each other. This was the heartbeat of the network. The promise of a fortune in ivory is what drove hunters further north, compelled traders to brave the White Sea, and motivated merchants to fund the long caravan trek south. Every other good, the furs, the amber, the silver itself, flowed in the wake of this primary, dazzling pull. The silver dirhams found in Scandinavian soil are not just coins. They are the final echo of a roar, heard and converted into currency halfway across the world. The glittering chess pieces and the heavy silver coins tell a story of connection, but they are silent on the price paid for their journey. This is the sixth, and perhaps most sobering mystery of the Arctic trade, the hidden human and environmental toll that funded this global network. The historical records celebrate the arrival of goods, not the losses along the way. How many ships, laden with hope and ivory, simply vanished into the sudden grip of pack ice or a white sea storm, leaving no trace? We will never know the number, but the sheer volume of successful voyages implies a steady, grim attrition was simply part of the cost of doing business. Each voyage was a calculated gamble against the most unforgiving geography on Earth. The suffering was not confined to the open ocean. Consider the Portage, that brutal overland relay where ships became sleds. The labor was Herculean. Teams of traders and hired porters, likely including local Slavic or Finnic peoples, would strain for days, dragging tons of wood and cargo across miles of muddy trails or frozen ground. The physical toll was immense, with injuries from slipping logs or crushing loads being a constant risk. Illness in the mosquito-infested summer lowlands or exposure during the bitter cold of other seasons would have claimed others. These individuals are invisible in the sagas, yet their effort was the literal backbone of the route, the muscle that bent geography to the will of commerce. At the very beginning of the chain, the hunt itself was a relentless and dangerous pursuit. Harvesting walrus ivory was not a casual affair. It was a direct confrontation with powerful, territorial animals in an unstable environment. From small boats in icy waters, hunters faced the very real possibility of being capsized, wounded, or lost. While we lack specific casualty counts, the archaeological record hints at the pressure. Studies of walrus bone collections from Norse sites in Greenland show a telling pattern over time. The tusks found in later centuries come from progressively younger animals and from populations further and further away. This suggests that intensive hunting led to local depletions, forcing the hunt to expand into new, even more remote and hazardous grounds to meet the insatiable demand from Baghdad. The trade network, in its success, was consuming its own foundation. This dark underbelly is rarely written down, but it is etched into the economics. The staggering value of a single, perfect walrus tusk in a Baghdad market was not just a reflection of its beauty or rarity. That price was a direct measure of the extreme danger, the brutal labor, and the vast distance woven into its story. Every dirham that made it back to Scandinavia was a token representing risk endured and lives altered. To understand this network fully is to acknowledge that this profound connection between the desert and the ice was not forged through goodwill alone, but through a harsh calculus of endurance and loss. This realization casts the entire enterprise in a different light, making its ultimate disappearance not just a historical footnote, but perhaps an inevitable reckoning. Ivory may have been the crown jewel, but no king travels alone. The perilous journey from the Arctic to Baghdad was economically viable because the ships and caravans carried a diverse portfolio of goods, a supporting cast of commodities that together created a resilient and complex web of trade. Alongside the precious tusks traveled other Arctic luxuries that held astonishing value in the sun-baked markets of the south. Think of the dense, winter-white pelt of an ermine or the deep, shadowy fur of a sable. In the scorching heat of Mesopotamia, these were not items of practical warmth. They were pure, wearable paradoxes. To drape oneself in the fur of an animal from the land of endless night was to perform a powerful magic. It displayed not just wealth, but a reach so vast it could summon the cold itself. A caliph or wealthy merchant wearing Arctic fox trim was making a silent, stunning statement. My influence stretches to the very edges of the map. This economic web, however, had a dark and tragic thread woven through it. Historical sources, including treaties and chronicles, note that among the commodities traded along these routes were individuals. In the brutal reality of the medieval economy, captured during conflicts in the Baltic and Slavic regions, these people became part of the North-South exchange. It is a grim facet that reminds us the connectivity of this era was not built on goodwill alone, but on a harsh system where human lives were sometimes counted alongside furs and silver. This aspect of the trade casts a long shadow, a sobering counterpoint to the story of luxury and discovery. Balancing this somber note was another, lighter treasure from the Baltic shores, amber. This fossilized resin, glowing like captured sunlight, was prized for its beauty and mystery. Southern buyers believed it held medicinal properties, that it could ward off illness or bring good fortune. Carved into beads, amulets, and intricate figurines, amber traveled south as a tangible piece of the northern forests, completing a symbolic trifecta. The trade moved ivory from the sea, furs from the land, and amber from the ancient trees. This mix was its genius. If a poor hunting season yielded fewer tusks, the value of exceptionally fine sable pelts could compensate. If political unrest in the Baltic disrupted the amber supply, the consistent demand for ivory kept the route financially attractive. This diversification was the economic shock absorber that allowed the network to survive for centuries. It meant that, for a trader setting out from the White Sea, his hull was never reliant on a single dream. He carried a basket of dreams, each with its own buyer in the bustling souks a continent away. Silver was the physical prize, but the most transformative cargo may have been weightless. For every ship that returned to Scandinavia's fjords heavy with Islamic coins, it also carried back an invisible cargo of ideas, technologies, and artistic visions that quietly reshaped the northern world. This is the seventh mystery of the Arctic network, what traveled north along the Silver Road. The material goods are dazzling enough. In graves across Sweden and Norway, archaeologists find delicate glass beads in vibrant cobalt blues and emerald greens. their chemical signature tracing them to workshops in Mesopotamia or Egypt. They uncover fragments of fine silk, a fabric so alien and luxurious it must have seemed woven from magic. They recover intricately crafted bronze vessels and ornate silver jewelry with artistic motifs, vines, geometric patterns, animals in graceful repose, that speak unmistakably of Middle Eastern craftsmanship, not Norse tradition. These were not just trinkets. They were the physical DNA of a distant, sophisticated civilization, carried into the heart of Viking-age society. A chieftain buried with a silk trim on his cloak or a set of Islamic glassware was making a profound statement. He was not just wealthy, he was connected to the great global currents, a man of the world. But the flow of ideas ran deeper than luxury. Consider the very silver they coveted. To handle thousands of foreign coins, Norse traders had to become financially literate in a global system. They adopted precise weights and scales to assay the silver's purity, learning the standards of Baghdad and Samarkand. This required a new level of numerical precision and trust in abstract value, moving beyond simple barter toward a more complex concept of money. This economic thinking would eventually influence how Norse kingdoms structured their own economies and taxation. The intellectual exchange may have even touched the heavens. Norse mythology and sagas are filled with sophisticated, almost obsessive references to the sun, the moon, and the stars, not just as gods, but as navigational markers. The Poetic Edda describes the sun being chased by a wolf, a mythic explanation for its movement. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, astronomy was a rigorous science, driven by the need to calculate prayer times and the direction of Mecca. Arab scholars possessed detailed star charts and understood celestial mechanics with unparalleled accuracy. Is it possible that whispers of this knowledge, tales of a science that could predict the sun's path, filtered back along the trade routes and found expression in Norse myth? We have no direct proof, but the coincidence of intense celestial interest in both cultures, connected by this silver bridge, is compelling. It suggests a meeting of minds, where myth and science may have brushed against each other in the long Arctic night. The most profound transfer, however, might have been one of political imagination. In the Norse homelands, power was traditionally local, built around a chieftain in a great hall. The traders who returned from the Volga or heard tales of Baghdad described something unimaginable: a city of 500,000 people, governed by a single ruler, the Caliph, who commanded not just warriors but scribes, judges, and a vast bureaucracy. They saw centralized states with written laws, standing armies, and complex systems of taxation that drew wealth from thousands of miles away. This concept of imperial power, of a kingdom as an administrative machine rather than a personal following, was a revolutionary idea. It is no accident that as the flow of silver peaked, we see the consolidation of the first true Norse kingdoms, like Norway. These new kings began to mint their own coins, impose territorial taxes, and project power in ways that echoed, however faintly, the models of the South. The trade route, then, was not just a conduit for goods, but a school. It educated the Norse elite in global commerce, exposed them to advanced science and art, and provided a blueprint for state power. The connection was profound, transforming Scandinavia from the periphery of the known world into an active, if distant, participant in the medieval global system. Yet for all its success, this brilliant network was living on borrowed time. Its existence depended on a fragile alignment of forces, stable demand, open routes, and a reliable source of Arctic wealth. What would happen when just one of those pillars began to crumble? This brilliant network pulsed to the rhythm of history, not as a permanent highway, but as a fleeting corridor of light. Its golden age was remarkably specific, burning for roughly 250 years, from the late 8th to the early 11th century. To understand why this window opened and then closed is to watch the alignment of three powerful stars in the medieval sky. First, in the east, the Abbasid Caliphate reached its zenith. Baghdad was the wealthiest city on earth, a voracious consumer of luxury goods with a stable, silver-based economy minting the very dirhams found in Scandinavian soil. Second, in the north, the Viking Age was in full expansion. Norse societies possessed the advanced ship technology, the maritime courage, and the entrepreneurial drive to seek new sources of wealth far beyond their homelands. Third, and critically, the political geography between them was just open enough. The river routes of Eastern Europe were active, but not yet dominated by a single monolithic power that could completely control or tax the trade into stagnation. For those 2.5 centuries, these conditions created a perfect storm of opportunity. The route thrived because Baghdad had the silver, Scandinavia had the means, and the wild spaces in between allowed for passage. But corridors of light are vulnerable to shadows falling at either end. The decline began not with a single event, but with a slow crumbling of the pillars that supported it. In the 11th century, the Abbasid Caliphate, once a unified economic powerhouse, began to fragment. Internal strife and the rise of rival dynasties disrupted the vast, centralized markets and the steady flow of silver from the mines of Central Asia. If the ultimate buyer becomes unstable, the entire chain feels the tremor. Simultaneously, the political landscape of the route itself transformed. Those very hybrid communities born of the trade into a more formal, powerful state. While this created stability, it also meant more efficient taxation and control over the traditional river routes. What was once a frontier of opportunity became a regulated toll road, squeezing the profit margin for the Arctic traders. Then came the earth-shaking events of the Crusades, starting at the end of the 11th century. These wars of faith and conquest between Christendom and the Islamic world violently redirected the focus, capital, and conflict of Europe. Trade patterns shifted south toward the Mediterranean, and the long, perilous Arctic to Volga pathway began to look less attractive compared to newer options. Finally, the environment itself may have delivered the closing blow. Scholars debate the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of regional cooling, but evidence suggests a trend toward harsher, more unpredictable conditions in the North Atlantic and Arctic from the 13th century onward. For a route that depended on reading the subtle signs of ice and current, increased storminess and heavier pack ice would have raised the risk from merely perilous to nearly impossible. The hunting grounds for walrus ivory in the North Atlantic also show signs of depletion, as we saw earlier, forcing voyages even further into treacherous waters for diminishing returns. The economic equation simply stopped balancing. The silver flow from the east slowed to a trickle. The southern markets became harder and more dangerous to reach, and the northern seas grew more hostile. The secret route did not vanish with a bang, but with a long, slow sigh. One by one, the trading families stopped sending their north into the White Sea. The seasonal market fell silent. The knowledge of the polar currents, so carefully guarded for generations, faded from memory. Within a century or two, the entire endeavor receded into the realm of saga and rumor, a half-remembered tale of a time when the North was connected to the world's heart. The silence of the trade route coincides with a cooling world. This timing raises an eighth, profound mystery that shifts our gaze from human ledgers to the Earth's own records. Could this entire network have been a fleeting gift of the climate itself? Historians and scientists now point to a climatic anomaly known as the medieval warm period, a phase of elevated temperatures across the North Atlantic region from roughly 950 to 1250 AD. This was not a global phenomenon in the modern sense, but a significant regional shift. Its existence is etched not in parchments, but in tree rings from ancient forests, in layers of sediment from lake beds, and in the chemical composition of ice cores drilled from Greenland's glaciers. These natural archives tell a story of milder winters and longer growing seasons in parts of Europe. For the Arctic, the implications are tantalizing. While still a place of extreme cold, this warmer phase may have meant less extensive summer sea ice and a longer annual window where the polar ocean was navigable. The pack ice, that formidable shifting wall, might have retreated further north for more of the year, creating the very corridors the Norse traders learned to exploit. The mystery lies in the degree of cause and effect. Was the medieval warm period the essential key that unlocked the door, a necessary precondition that made the Arctic route imaginable? Or did Norse ingenuity and sheer determination simply adapt to a still brutal environment, with the slightly milder conditions merely providing a marginal, helpful advantage? The answer likely lies in a subtle interplay between planetary cycles and human ambition. Imagine a seasoned captain from observing the ice. He would not have known of climatic epochs, but he and his father would have possessed a deep, generational memory of the sea's rhythms. They would have noticed if the period of open water near the coast seemed to last a few precious weeks longer than in their grandfathers' tales. Those extra weeks could mean the difference between a successful round trip to and a disastrous entrapment. They could allow for more predictable scheduling, reducing the terrifying gamble of each voyage. This climatic hypothesis intertwines human history with the Earth's long, slow heartbeat. It suggests that the rise of this global trade network was not just a story of economics and courage, but also one of environmental opportunity. The route flourished during a specific, favorable alignment of societal drive and planetary conditions. When those conditions later shifted, as the climate began its slow descent toward the colder era known as the Little Ice Age, the window of opportunity began to slam shut. Thicker, more persistent ice would have made the navigation too unreliable, the risks too catastrophic. The trade did not fail because people forgot how to sail. It faded because the world they sailed on changed beneath their hulls. This perspective adds a poignant layer to the story. The silver dirhams in the soil are not just tokens of commerce, but also relics of a warmer past, physical evidence of a time when the Earth's climate conspired with human curiosity to connect distant worlds. It frames the entire enterprise as a magnificent, temporary bridge built on ice that was, for a few centuries, just thin enough to cross. A single piece of patterned silk can speak volumes. In a grave at the Great Viking Trading Center in Sweden, archaeologists uncovered a fragment of cloth woven with a complex, repeating design utterly foreign to Scandinavia. Chemical analysis traced its dyes and weaving technique directly to workshops in Central Asia, possibly even the region of modern-day Uzbekistan. This was not a coin, a mere token of value. This was personal. It was a luxury item, likely a trim on a garment, chosen by someone of high status to be buried with them for eternity. Its presence tells us that the connections forged by the Arctic trade were intimate and aesthetic, shaping not just economies but personal identity and taste. The evidence builds from such intimate fragments into a staggering mosaic. In Norse workshops, metalworkers crafted beautiful brooches and pendants. When modern scientists subject these pieces to spectroscopic analysis, they can read the unique chemical fingerprint of the metal. Astonishingly, the alloy composition of some Norse silver jewelry matches ores mined not in Europe, but in the ancient silver mines of the Middle East, like those in Afghanistan. This means the silver was not just melted down from coins. Sometimes, the raw material itself, or the finished luxury object, made the entire journey north. Each artifact is a silent witness to a supply chain of breathtaking complexity. On the other end of the route, in the suspected lands of along the White Sea, the evidence is more subtle but equally telling. Excavations reveal not grand palaces, but specific, repeated patterns in the soil. Researchers find dense, concentrated layers of charcoal from hearths, mixed with fish bones, fragments of trade goods like standardized weights, and evidence of temporary structures. Crucially, these layers appear only in certain strata, corresponding to summer months, and are separated by sterile layers of winter sediment. This is the archaeological signature of a seasonal market, a place that pulsed with life for a few frantic weeks each year, and then returned to silence, exactly as the historical model predicts. Beyond the grand artifacts, It is the small, incidental finds that often paint the most vivid picture. A single cowrie shell, native only to the warm waters of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, found in a Norse settlement in Iceland. A tiny, precisely carved Islamic glass weight, used to measure precious metals on a merchant's scale, discovered far from any caliphate. These objects were not the primary cargo, they were the cultural stowaways, the pocket change of a connected world. They slipped into chests and sacks, carried by traders as curios or keepsakes, and ended up thousands of miles from their origin. Each one is a pixel, and when assembled, these pixels resolve into a picture that fundamentally rewrites our map of the medieval world. It shows us a north that was not isolated or backward, but actively engaged in a dialogue that stretched from the ice floes to the deserts, collecting silk for its dead and silver for its living, all along a road of frozen water. The silence in our own history books is itself a clue. For a trade network of such staggering scale and importance, the written records from the Norse world are frustratingly sparse, a collection of hints wrapped in saga poetry. This is the ninth mystery of the Arctic route, the profound gap in the written record, and what that silence truly means. Why would such a monumental achievement be so cryptically mentioned, if at all? The answer points to a powerful, practical motive: deliberate secrecy. For the merchant families who mastered the ice corridors and the river portages, this knowledge was their most valuable asset. To write down detailed sailing directions, maps of the White Sea currents, or the location of the markets would be commercial suicide. It would hand their hard-won advantage to competitors. So they kept it close, an oral tradition passed from captain to heir, protected by layers of vague legend. The Norse sagas reflect this protective obscurity. In the saga of The Journey to is treated as a known, almost routine expedition, but its precise location and the specifics of the trade are left hauntingly vague. The destination is simply the North, a place of wealth and danger, its details blurred into the mythic. The written record, therefore, becomes a study in absence. The actors themselves had every reason not to write the manual. The irony is that the clearest descriptions come from observers thousands of miles away who had no stake in the secrecy. Arab geographers and diplomats, with their thriving culture of scholarship and exploration, were meticulous documentarians. Scholars like Allen wrote with fascinated detail about the traders who appeared on the Volga. They recorded the goods these northerners brought, the sable, the black fox, the fish-teeth ivory, and noted they came from lands of immense cold and long nights. These accounts are not vague, they are clinical observations of a commercial phenomenon. This disparity in records is a powerful lesson in how history is written. Sometimes, the full story of a people is not found in their own annals, but in the careful notes of those who watched them arrive from a distant shore. The Norse were the actors, living the arduous reality of the journey. The Arab scholars were the audience, cataloging the astonishing results. One culture protected its secrets, the other sought to understand the world. Our knowledge of this global connection is therefore a mosaic, pieced together from cryptic verses in the north and detailed ledgers in the south. It reminds us that history is not a single story told from one perspective, but a conversation, often an indirect one, across cultures and centuries. The silence in the sagas is not an empty space. It is the sound of a trade secret, fiercely guarded, echoing across time. That fragment of silk from did not travel alone. It was part of a system so vast and significant, it deserves a title that matches its grandeur. To truly grasp its scale, we must view this Arctic Volga network for what it was, the Silk Road of the North. For centuries, the legendary Silk Road has captured our imagination, a ribbon of commerce linking the empires of China and Rome. But that was only one of the world's great superhighways. While caravans moved silk and spices across the deserts of Central Asia, another, shadow counterpart was operating in parallel, far to the north. Its geography was a mirror image, connecting a completely different ecological zone, the circumpolar world of ice, forest, and tundra, directly to the thriving core of the Islamic Caliphate. In terms of sheer distance, the northern route was shorter. A trader going from the White Sea to Baghdad covered less ground than one traveling the full breadth of Asia, but distance is a poor measure of difficulty. The northern route traded the scorching, open deserts for the frozen, claustrophobic sea. It exchanged the mountain passes of the Pamirs for the soul-crushing labor of portaging ships through endless, mosquito-ridden forests. Both networks were engines for moving the most precious luxuries of their time: Chinese silks and porcelain south, Arctic furs and ivory north. Both were conduits for something far more powerful than goods. They carried ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and sadly, the unseen travelers of illness, which moved silently alongside the caravans and ships, reshaping populations. Yet their characters were profoundly different. The classic Silk Road is remembered for its grand oasis cities, Samarkand, permanent monuments to trade built in stone and adobe. The Northern Silk Road was defined by its ephemeral nature. Its hubs were not glittering metropolises, but the seasonal, silent market appearing and vanishing with the summer sun. Its were not caravanserais with permanent guards, but temporary campsites on a riverbank, their traces so faint they challenge archaeologists to find them. This gave the northern network a clandestine, almost ghostly quality. It was a trade of whispers and trusted guides, of knowledge guarded more fiercely than any city wall. It operated in the margins of the map, in the long twilight of the Arctic summer, connecting worlds that the rest of medieval society believed were separate. Recognizing this route as the Northern Silk Road does more than just grant it a grand title. It fundamentally rewrites our mental map of the medieval globe. It shows us that global connection was not a singular east-west phenomenon, but a multi-directional web. While one stream of history flowed across the continents, another, equally powerful current was moving vertically, from the top of the world down into its very heart. Yet even the most resilient web can fray when too many threads are cut at once. The 10th and final mystery of this Arctic network is not its existence, but its quiet vanishing. Why did a system that thrived for centuries, connecting continents and funding fortunes, simply fade from use? The answer lies not in a single cataclysm, but in a perfect storm of shifting worlds, where changes in faith, power, and the environment itself conspired to close the corridor. First, the great southern engine of demand began to sputter. After the 10th century, the unified Abbasid Caliphate, that boundless consumer of Arctic luxuries, fragmented into competing dynasties. The political instability disrupted the vast, secure markets and the steady flow of silver from the mines. When the ultimate buyer becomes uncertain, the entire supply chain, stretching back thousands of miles, begins to tremble. A merchant could no longer be sure his journey would end with a reliable profit in a stable market. Simultaneously, a spiritual revolution was transforming the North. The Christianization of Scandinavia did more than change gods. It realigned cultural and commercial compasses. Trade alliances began to pivot south and west, toward the rising Christian kingdoms of Europe, rather than east toward the Islamic world. New ethical frameworks, influenced by the Church, sometimes cast a disapproving eye on certain aspects of the old trade practices, further cooling relationships with non-Christian partners. The northern traders were integrating into a different European community, with different priorities. Then came a new commercial giant in the Baltic. The rise of the League from the 12th century onward created a powerful, organized network of trade cities much closer to home. Why risk the horrific journey to the White Sea and beyond when you could sail the relatively safer Baltic to ports like Novgorod and trade for Flemish cloth, German silver, and Baltic grain? The League offered efficiency, predictability, and volume, a modern corporate answer to the old, perilous entrepreneurial model. It siphoned off capital and attention, making the Arctic route seem increasingly archaic and unnecessarily dangerous. Finally, the foundation of the trade itself may have crumbled. We saw the archaeological evidence of hunting pressure. The relentless demand for walrus ivory likely pushed hunters to take younger animals and venture into ever more dangerous grounds. It is possible that the most accessible walrus populations along the known hunting routes were depleted to a point where the hunt was no longer commercially viable. When the primary treasure becomes too scarce to reliably find, the entire economic reason for the journey evaporates. The end, therefore, was not a dramatic collapse marked by sunken fleets or conquered cities. It was a slow, quiet fading. One year, a trading family decided the risk was too great for the potential return. Then another. The specialized knowledge of the ice currents and the silent marketplaces, passed orally for generations, was no longer taught to the next generation because there was no longer a next generation of Arctic merchants. The route did not vanish from a map. It vanished from memory, receding into the realm of folklore and half-remembered saga verses about the distant, wealthy land of. Its disappearance is a profound lesson in the fragility of connection. It shows that global networks are living things, sustained by a delicate balance of demand, safety, supply, and knowledge. When enough of those pillars are removed, even the most brilliant road can simply cease to be, leaving behind only silver coins in the soil and a lingering question about the worlds we once knew. The trail of the Northern Silk Road did not end in the Middle Ages. It lay dormant for centuries, a ghost in the soil and a whisper in old texts, until a new generation of detectives began to piece the fragments back together. This modern rediscovery is a detective story that spans continents and disciplines, proving that history is not just about finding things, but about learning how to listen to what they are trying to say. The first clues were the coins themselves. In the 19th century, as antiquarians and early archaeologists began systematically cataloging finds across Scandinavia, a curious pattern emerged. They kept pulling silver dirhams from the earth, coins stamped with elegant Arabic script proclaiming the oneness of God, found in the most unlikely northern places. Numismatists, the specialists who study currency, became the first codebreakers. By cataloging mint marks and dates, they could trace these coins not just to the Abbasid Caliphate, but to specific cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Merv. They could even follow the ebb and flow of the silver tide, noting that the flood of coins peaked in the 10th century and then trickled to a stop. The coins were a signal, but they were only one piece of a vast, scattered puzzle. The 20th century brought the spade to the story. Systematic archaeological digs in Russia and Scandinavia began to provide context. Excavations at sites like Novgorod revealed the cosmopolitan trading posts of where Norse, Slavic, and Baltic artifacts mingled. But the real breakthroughs came from the edges of the map. In the 1970s and 80s, Soviet and later Russian archaeologists working along the shores of the White Sea began uncovering those strange, seasonal campsites. They found the standardized weights, the temporary hearths, and the lack of permanent structures. This was the physical proof of not as a mythical kingdom, but as a functional, transient marketplace. Each carefully sifted layer of soil was a page from a lost ledger, confirming the trade existed exactly where the sagas vaguely suggested. Then, science added a voice to the silent artifacts. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, revolutionary techniques allowed researchers to ask new questions of old objects. Take a single walrus tusk fragment found in a workshop in Baghdad. Using stable isotope analysis, scientists can now analyze the chemical signature locked within the ivory. The ratios of certain elements reflect the water and food the walrus consumed, creating a geographic fingerprint. This allows researchers to say, with astonishing precision, that this particular tusk came not from a generic Arctic source, but from a walrus population that lived and fed in the waters off eastern Greenland, or perhaps from the sea near the White Sea. This turns a commodity into a biography. We can now trace the journey of an individual tusk from a specific hunting ground, across the sea, down the rivers, and into the hands of a craftsman thousands of miles away. It is the closest we can come to watching the trade happen. Yet artifacts and isotopes are raw data. The final, crucial step was taken by historians who dared to connect the dots across this vast canvas. Scholars like Thomas S. meticulously analyzed the flow of Islamic silver into northern Europe, weaving numismatic data with Russian chronicles to model the economics of the route. Elle, in her landmark work on pre-modern world systems, positioned this northern network as a crucial, parallel counterpart to the famous Silk Roads, arguing for a 13th-century world linked by multiple circuits of exchange. These thinkers performed a kind of intellectual synthesis. They took the coins from the numismatists, the site reports from the archaeologists, and the data from the chemists, and they braided these threads into a single, coherent narrative. They transformed a scattering of curious finds into a recognized historical phenomenon, a global trade route that our simplest maps. Their work reminds us that history is often hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to ask the right questions and to see the connections between a coin in a field, a campfire on a remote shore, and the chemical memory of a long-lost walrus. The silver coins and silk fragments tell a story of trade, but a deeper, biological story is etched into human cells. While ships carried goods back and forth, people themselves moved along this Arctic highway, and some never returned home. This leads us to the 11th mystery of this forgotten route, the genetic legacy. Who stayed behind, and what can their descendants tell us about the nature of this connection? Modern science now allows us to ask the past a direct question by looking at the DNA of people living in the regions once traversed by the Norse traders. Researchers have begun searching for specific genetic markers, like Scandinavian Y chromosome lineages, in populations along the Volga River and near the Caucasus Mountains. The results are not a dramatic wave, but a faint, intriguing signal. These northern genetic signatures are present, but they are subtle and woven into a much richer local tapestry. This complexity is the heart of the mystery. What does this limited gene flow actually represent? One compelling interpretation points to the traders themselves. Imagine a Norse merchant from a place like. After years of traveling the river route, he might have chosen to settle permanently at a key trading hub like Bulgar or a settlement along the upper Volga. He would have married a local woman, started a family, and integrated into the community. His children would carry his genetic lineage, but they would grow up speaking the local language, adopting local customs, and seeing themselves as part of that world. Their Scandinavian ancestry would become a family story, a private heirloom like a buried coin, gradually fading over generations into a biological trace. This scenario paints a picture of slow, peaceful assimilation, where individuals built bridges not just of commerce, but of family. The genetic evidence, when layered with archaeological finds of Norse-style artifacts in these same regions, supports the idea of small, settled communities rather than just temporary camps. However, history is rarely a single narrative. There is another, more somber possibility that must be considered within the full context of the era. Historical sources from the time note that among the commodities moved northward were individuals acquired through conflict. It is possible that some of the genetic signal represents not the settlers, but those who were taken on the return journey. This aspect reminds us that the medieval economy, for all its sophistication, operated within a moral framework vastly different from our own. The movement of people was a tragic reality of the time, and its faint echo in the genetic record is a sobering counterpoint to the story of luxury goods and cultural exchange. Yet the overall genetic picture suggests integration, not isolation. The Scandinavian markers are not found in isolated clusters, but are blended into the population. This indicates that over time, whether through marriage or other circumstances, these individuals and their descendants became part of the local fabric. They were not a separate, ruling class maintaining pure bloodlines. They were absorbed. This biological evidence completes a more intimate portrait of the Arctic trade network. It was not a sterile exchange of objects between strangers who never met. It was a human system, sustained by relationships that could last a lifetime and ripple across generations. People fell in love, had children, and put down roots far from their ancestral homes. The route was not just a corridor for silver and furs. It was a channel for human stories, for the mixing of families and the slow, quiet knitting together of worlds. The genetic whispers we detect today are the final living testament to those choices, a reminder that the most enduring legacy of any journey is often written not in ledgers, but in us. The real journey ended, but the story did not. For centuries after the last sailed from the White Sea, its memory lingered in the collective imagination of both North and South, fermenting into powerful myth. The harsh, alien landscapes witnessed by Norse traders, the endless summer sun, the grinding ice, the vast, silent tundra needed a place in their cosmology. They found it in the land of the giants. This was no pleasant realm. Norse sagas describe it as a wild, rocky, and frozen place on the outermost edges of the world, a territory of primordial chaos and immense, often hostile beings. It is strikingly reminiscent of the Arctic coast, a land of extreme scale, where icebergs could be seen as frozen giants and the indigenous, with their different languages and customs, might have been perceived as otherworldly. The myth served as a cultural container, a way to process and explain the terrifying, awe-inspiring reality of the far north they had actually visited. Far to the south, in the libraries and courts of the Islamic world, a different kind of legend took shape. Geographers and scholars, piecing together traveler accounts, spoke of a distant, cold land sealed off by a great barrier, inhabited by savage tribes known as Endor and Magog. These were not mere people but apocalyptic forces, destined to break forth at the end of time. While these legends had roots in earlier religious texts, the descriptions of their location, often placed in the distant, impenetrable north, began to intertwine with vague knowledge of the lands from which the traders came. The Arctic, a place of perpetual winter and mysterious peoples, became a perfect candidate for this mythic prison. The traders themselves, with their strange tattoos, formidable stature, and different faith, could easily be woven into this existing tapestry of the monstrous other. This mirroring of myths is a profound cultural echo. It reveals how direct, physical contact between worlds, however commercial in nature, inevitably sparks a story. When reality is too vast, too strange, or too complex to fully document, the human mind translates it into the language of legend. For the Norse, the Arctic became a mythic geography of giants. For the Islamic scholars, the Norse homelands became tinged with an apocalyptic mystery. Neither perception was entirely accurate, but both were born from a kernel of truth. A real, perilous connection had been made. The myths were the psychological souvenirs of a trade route, the way each civilization preserved and made sense of the staggering fact that a completely different world existed at the opposite end of their experience. They shaped perceptions for centuries, long after the silver stopped flowing, proving that the most durable cargo of all is often a story. The silence of the written record is most profound for those who knew the land best. Our story has followed the Norse traders and tracked their silver, but they did not walk this frozen ground alone. The 12th mystery of this network lies with its indispensable, yet often overlooked, architects, the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and subarctic. Groups like the Sami in Scandinavia and the ancestors of today's Nenets and Komi peoples in Russia were not passive bystanders to this global trade. They were the original experts, the holders of knowledge without which the entire venture would have been impossible. The true nature of their partnership with the Norse is one of history's quietest, most crucial questions. Was this a meeting of equals, a relationship of mutual benefit, or was it a story of extraction where northern wealth flowed south, leaving little but fragments behind? The written sagas, told from the Norse perspective, offer only glimpses, usually framing these encounters as transactions with the mysterious. To hear the other side of the story, we must listen to the ground. Archaeology at indigenous sites across the northern reaches paints a compelling, if subtle, picture. In Sami settlement areas and offering sites in northern Sweden and Norway, researchers consistently find objects that originated far to the south. Among the bones and stone tools appear fragments of Norse iron, pieces of decorated bronze vessels, and even occasional silver coins or hack silver. These were not looted goods. They were acquired, traded, and valued enough to be kept, used, and sometimes ritually deposited. This tells us that indigenous communities were active, conscious participants in the network. They were trading their most valuable local resources, the furs of animals they expertly hunted, the precious reindeer antler, perhaps guides and survival knowledge, for durable, useful, or prestigious goods from the outside world. The economic relationship, therefore, was real and transactional, but the scale and the terms of that trade are where the mystery deepens. An iron knife blade was a revolutionary tool for working wood or preparing hides, far superior to stone. A bronze pot could transform cooking. For these advantages, communities may have willingly engaged in trade. However, the balance of power was inherently uneven. The Norse arrived with ships and the promise of continuous demand, a demand that could alter traditional hunting patterns. There is a risk that over time, the relationship could shift from trade toward a form of dependency or tribute, where indigenous hunters felt pressure to produce ever greater quantities of furs to maintain access to these new, durable technologies. The archaeological record hints at this complexity. While Norse goods are found, they are often found in modest quantities, repurposed, and blended seamlessly into a material culture that remained distinctly indigenous. This suggests these communities were not culturally overwhelmed. They were selective, integrating what was useful while maintaining their own identity and way of life. They were not merely suppliers in a Norse-controlled chain, but savvy negotiators in a system they helped enable. Their greatest contribution was intangible: knowledge. The Norse learned to read the ice, predict the weather, and navigate the coastlines from those who had lived with these rhythms for. This was the true currency of the partnership, and it was priceless. To view them only as victims or passive sources is to misunderstand the dynamics of the frontier. They held the keys to the kingdom, and their cooperation was not given lightly. Their lasting legacy in this story is not a pile of silver, but the very existence of the root itself. By choosing to trade, by sharing their understanding of the land, they became the essential middlemen in a global exchange, connecting their ancestral world to markets they would never see. Their perspective, though unheard in written words, is permanently etched into the success of the entire perilous network. This forgotten route rewrites the map of the medieval world. We often confine our imagination of globalization to the warm, sunlit lanes of the Mediterranean or the storied caravans of the Silk Road. Yet by the year 1000, a single walrus tusk could complete a journey from the crushing pack ice of the Arctic Ocean to the sun-drenched courtyard of a Baghdad palace. This was not a sporadic accident, but a sustained, operational network that connected two ecosystems and two human experiences that were literally worlds apart. It forces us to expand our definition of what a connected world looked like. The medieval globe was not a series of isolated civilizations with a few famous roads between them. It was a web, a constellation of interlocking circuits, and this Arctic highway was one of its most daring strands. It proves that innovation and relentless risk-taking could forge links across what seemed to be impossible barriers, not just mountains and deserts, but a frozen, shifting sea and a continent of endless forest. This was not trade on the margins. It was a central artery of its time, pumping luxury, silver, and ideas between the ecological extremes of the planet. The existence of this route is a profound testament to human ambition and ingenuity. Long before satellite navigation and container ships, people organized a supply chain of breathtaking complexity and endurance. They coordinated hunters on the ice, shipwrights in the fjords, porters in the forests, and merchants across continents, all to satisfy a desire for beauty and status in a distant desert capital. This challenges a subtle, modern arrogance. We often assume our era invented globalization, that our connectivity is unprecedented. But the story of the Northern Silver Road humbles that notion. It reveals a deep history of global interdependence, where a chieftain in Norway and a caliph in Baghdad were linked by a chain of hands, each depending on the other for symbols of their power and place in the world. Their connection was slower, far more perilous, but no less real or transformative. It reminds us that the drive to reach beyond the horizon, to trade and to connect, is a fundamental thread in the human story, one that was being woven in the stark beauty of the midnight sun long before we gave it a name. The ultimate test of this forgotten route is not in a book, but on the water. Could a modern crew, using only the tools and knowledge available 1,000 years ago, actually retrace the entire perilous journey from a Scandinavian fjord to the sea? This is the 13th and final mystery, a challenge that moves from theory into the realm of salt, sweat, and wood. To attempt it would be to build a time machine not of metal, but of oak and tar, sailing directly into the heart of the historical question. The first step is the ship itself. A faithful replica of the broad-beamed cargo vessel of the Norse would need to be constructed using only hand tools and traditional methods. Its hull would be clinker-built, with overlapping planks sealed with wool and pine tar, designed to flex with the ocean's might rather than resist it. This vessel would be loaded not with GPS units and satellite phones, but with the cargo of the age: bundles of replica furs, blocks of bog iron, and barrels of fresh water. Its navigation would rely on the ancient toolkit: a sunstone to find the sun through cloud, a keen observation of seabirds and whale spouts, and the memorized rhythms of the tides and currents described in old texts. The crew would have to learn to read the sea as a language, interpreting the color of the water and the shape of the clouds for signs of the ice ahead. The Arctic leg would be the most daunting physical barrier. Even with modern knowledge of weather patterns, sailing a small, open-decked wooden ship along the coast of Norway and into the sea would be an exercise in profound vulnerability. The crew would face the disorienting perpetual daylight of the midnight sun, the sudden, dense fogs that swallow the horizon, and the ever-present threat of encountering drift ice. Finding the entrance to the White Sea and then the specific river mouth that led to the legendary would be a triumph of traditional wayfinding, a moment where saga descriptions would have to match the reality of a changing coastline. Then comes the true measure of the endeavor, the portage. Upon reaching the headwaters of the northern, the modern adventurers would face the same backbreaking ordeal as their medieval counterparts. Every item, along with the ship itself, would need to be unloaded. Using rollers, ropes, and pure human strength, they would have to drag the several-ton vessel across miles of forest and bog to reach the next river flowing east. This single act, repeated multiple times across the watershed, would translate historical accounts of hardship into a tangible, exhausting reality. It would reveal the portage not as a footnote, but as the central, grueling pivot upon which the entire trade route turned. Yet the challenges are not only natural. The world has been mapped and divided in ways the medieval traders never knew. Modern political borders would present a labyrinth of permissions and regulations, sailing through the territorial waters of multiple nations, entering river systems that are now sensitive ecological zones, and arranging to haul a wooden ship across private and state lands would require a diplomacy as complex as the navigation. The journey would become a negotiation with the present as much as an exploration of the past. Could it be done, perhaps in stages, with meticulous planning and a deep respect for the limits of historical technology? Such an expedition would be more than an adventure. It would be the ultimate experiential archaeology. Every blister from the oar, every anxious night watching for ice, every successful landfall using only the sun and stars would be a data point. It would measure the feasibility of the hypothesis in the most human terms possible, through fatigue, fear, and elation. To complete it would be to finally close the circle, not with a theory, but with a voyage, proving that the connection between the Arctic and Baghdad was not just possible, but was achieved through a resilience we can barely fathom from the comfort of history. This hidden history of ice and silver is more than a forgotten footnote. It is a mirror, reflecting back profound truths about our own world, truths written in the language of climate, commerce, and connection. The first lesson is written in the very ice itself. The route's golden age coincided with the medieval warm period, a time when slightly milder conditions may have made the Arctic corridors just navigable enough. This is a stark reminder that climate is not a static backdrop for human history, but an active, shaping character. A subtle shift in global temperature patterns did not just change the weather. It opened a historical door, enabling a connection between continents. When that climatic window later began to close, contributing to the route's decline, it shows us the opposite truth. Environmental change can also be a force of separation, silently erasing roads and severing ties that once seemed permanent. Our ancestors' fortunes were intimately tied to planetary cycles they could not name, a humbling perspective for an era defined by our own impact on those very cycles. The engine for this entire perilous enterprise was not geopolitical ambition, but something more personal: desire. The insatiable demand in Baghdad for Arctic ivory and furs created a gravitational pull so powerful it drew traders into the Earth's most unforgiving environment. This reveals a fundamental driver of human exploration and risk. We often mythologize explorers seeking knowledge for its own sake, but behind many great journeys lies a simple, powerful economic equation. The pursuit of luxury, of beauty, status, and rarity has repeatedly funded the mapping of the unknown. It provided the capital, the motivation, and the relentless patience required to turn a dangerous idea into a regular highway. This network was a masterpiece of logistics built on a foundation of want. It also forces us to recalibrate our sense of time when we think about a connected world. We speak of globalization as a modern phenomenon, a product of jet engines and the internet. But the Arctic trade route is a 1,000-year-old blueprint for a globalized supply chain. It coordinated hunters on the ice, shipwrights in the fjords, porters in the forests, and merchants across deserts, all moving specific commodities to meet a specific demand half a world away. This was not a primitive barter system. It was a sophisticated, long-distance economic network with shared standards of value, intricate logistics, and profound mutual dependency. Our modern global economy did not emerge from a vacuum. It stands on the deep, ancient roots of such forgotten connections, proving that the human impulse to trade across vast distances is a timeless constant. Perhaps the most vital lesson, however, lies in the human relationships it uncovers. Our popular imagination often casts the medieval world in stark, simplistic conflicts: Christendom versus Islam, Vikings versus everyone else. This history shatters that caricature. For centuries, Norse traders and the Islamic Caliphate were engaged in a complex, sustained, and mutually beneficial partnership. They were not eternal enemies, but essential commercial partners. The Norse provided the luxuries that symbolized power in Baghdad, while the Abbasid economy provided the silver that fueled transformation in the north. This was a narrative of connection, of dialogue across profound cultural and religious differences, driven by shared interest and mutual gain. It is a story far more instructive for our own fragmented world than the well-worn tales of endless conflict. It reminds us that history is not a single story of clash, but a tapestry woven from countless threads of encounter, exchange, and quiet cooperation. The silent testimony of a coin minted in Baghdad and buried in Sweden speaks louder than 1,000 sagas of war, offering a forgotten model of how different worlds can meet, not on a battlefield, but in the common language of commerce and curiosity. The perilous Arctic trade route stands as a silent monument, not of stone, but of ice and ambition. It was a secret highway carved by human desire, a testament to what happens when curiosity and commerce meet at the edge of the possible. We have traced this forgotten thread from the misty Scandinavian fjords, across the treacherous, sunlit Arctic Sea, down the sprawling veins of Eastern Europe's rivers, over the rugged spine of the Caucasus, and into the dazzling heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. Along the way, we uncovered mysteries of celestial navigation with sunstones, the fluid identity of the traders, and the profound cultural exchange encoded in silk and silver. This journey does more than add a footnote to history. It radically expands our map of the medieval world. That map is no longer a simple collection of isolated kingdoms connected by a few famous roads. It is a vibrant, interconnected web, with strands reaching into the most unexpected places, like a shimmering thread of silver connecting the land of the midnight sun to the city of 1,001 nights. This story reveals a past far more dynamic and daring than our textbooks often suggest, a time when the drive to connect could overcome the planet's most formidable barriers. Let this hidden corridor inspire you to look beyond the familiar narratives, to question the empty spaces on old maps, and to listen for the whispers of connection in the artifacts left behind. Every silver coin in a Swedish field is an invitation to a grander story. If you found this voyage into history's frozen crossroads compelling, there are countless more forgotten corners waiting to be explored. For more journeys into the mysteries of our shared past, subscribe and join our community of curious minds. We would love to hear your thoughts on this incredible Arctic connection. What part of this epic journey resonated most with you? Share your reflections in the comments below.